Hey everyone, tonight we journey into one of the most mysterious chapters of ancient history, a story that begins in the cradle of civilization itself and reaches into the heavens above. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep explorations into humanity's forgotten past. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see this community spread across continents and time zones, to know that we're all connected through our shared curiosity about the ancient world, about the mysteries that have puzzled scholars for generations, and about the questions that keep drawing us back to these ancient texts. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe brew some tea or coffee, turn on that fan for some ambient white noise, and let's ease into tonight's exploration together. Pour yourself a drink, settle into your favourite chair, and prepare for a journey that will take us from the dusty plains of ancient Iraq to the summit of Mount Hermon, from the halls of heaven to the prison chambers deep beneath the earth. We're going to talk about beings that descended from the sky, forbidden knowledge passed to humanity, giants that once walked the earth, and divine judgment that shook the foundations of the ancient world. This isn't mythology in the sense of made-up fairy tales or primitive superstition crafted by people who didn't know any better. These are accounts preserved in some of humanity's oldest written records, carved into clay tablets thousands of years before the Common Era, texts that were buried beneath the sands of Mesopotamia for millennia and only rediscovered in the past 2 centuries by archaeologists who could scarcely believe what they were reading. The story we're exploring tonight touches on some of the deepest questions humans have ever asked, questions that have echoed through millennia and continue to resonate in our modern world. Where did we come from? Not just as individuals or even as a species, but as civilizations, as thinking beings capable of art and science and philosophy. Why is there evil in the world? If creation began in goodness or neutral potentiality, how did corruption, violence, and malice enter the picture? Have we always been alone on this planet, the only conscious intelligence, or have other beings, perhaps from beyond our realm or dimension, intervened in human history, shaping events in ways we barely understand? The answers we find in these ancient texts are both fascinating and unsettling, offering explanations that challenge our modern assumptions about the nature of reality, the structure of the cosmos, and the forces that have shaped human destiny. They speak of a time before the Great Flood, an antediluvian age when the boundaries between heaven and earth were more permeable, when divine beings walked among humans not as distant abstract forces but as physical presences that could be seen and touched and heard. It was a time when giants dominated the landscape, creatures of such immense size and power that normal humans were as grasshoppers before them, utterly helpless in the face of their violence and appetites. It was an era when knowledge that was meant to remain hidden, mysteries reserved for the divine realm, was revealed to humanity with catastrophic consequences, unleashing forces that humanity was not prepared to control or even understand. These aren't modern conspiracy theories or New Age speculation, or the imaginative inventions of creative writers trying to sell books. These are the beliefs of ancient peoples, recorded in their own words, in languages that were forgotten for thousands of years until scholars painstakingly deciphered them in the 1800s and 1900s, brick by linguistic brick, sign by sign, slowly unlocking the secrets that had lain buried in the ruins of dead civilizations. Tonight's journey takes us through multiple ancient traditions that seem to tell variations of the same fundamental story, a narrative so compelling and so disturbing that it appears across cultures and continents, expressed in different languages and through different theological frameworks, but maintaining a core consistency that demands explanation. We'll begin in the dust-covered libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, where clay tablets speak of divine beings called the Anunnaki, gods who descended from the heavens to establish civilization and teach humanity the foundational arts of culture. We'll examine their role in Sumerian religion, their alleged descent from the cosmic realm above, and their involvement in creating and instructing the human race. Then we'll move forward in time to the Second Temple period of Judaism, roughly 500 years before Christ to 70 years after, when texts like the Book of Enoch provided elaborate accounts of angels called Watchers who abandoned their heavenly posts, descended to earth, and pursued forbidden desires with human women, producing monstrous offspring and teaching dangerous knowledge. We'll trace the parallels between these traditions, examining not just the similarities but also the significant differences in how various cultures understood and interpreted these events. We'll look at the evidence, both textual and archaeological, considering what hard facts we possess and where speculation and interpretation begin. We'll examine the theological implications of these narratives, asking what they meant to the people who believed them and what they might mean for us today if we take them seriously as descriptions of actual historical events, rather than dismissing them as mere mythology. The story is complex, spanning thousands of years and multiple cultures, involving civilizations separated by vast distances and different languages, yet the core narrative remains remarkably consistent across all these sources, suggesting either a shared cultural inheritance, independent descriptions of the same reality, or a combination of both. The story begins in ancient Sumer, in southern Mesopotamia, in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is today the nation of Iraq, a land that has been continuously inhabited for over 10,000 years and has witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Around 5,000 years ago, approximately 3,200 years before the Common Era, the Sumerians developed something that would change human civilization forever and set us on a path we're still walking today. They created writing, not just simple pictographs or basic symbols to represent concrete objects, but a sophisticated, systematic method of recording language, a true writing system capable of expressing any thought that could be spoken, any idea that could be conceived. They developed cuneiform, a script of wedge-shaped, marks pressed into soft clay tablets with a reed stylus, creating permanent records that could be stored, transported, and read by anyone who had learned the system. The word cuneiform itself comes from the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge, referring to the characteristic triangular impression made by pressing a cut reed at an angle into wet clay. This wasn't a simple or obvious invention that naturally suggested itself. It required abstract thinking of a very high order, the cognitive leap to understand that spoken language, which exists as sound waves in air and disappears the moment it's uttered, could be represented by visual symbols that persist across time and space. It required the development of a systematic approach to encoding information, a method of breaking down the continuous flow of speech into discrete units that could be represented by specific marks. And it required a social structure that valued record-keeping enough to invest the substantial resources necessary to train scribes, produce materials, and maintain archives. The earliest Sumerian writing appeared around 3200 BCE in the ancient city of Uruk, one of the world's first true urban centers, a city that at its peak may have housed 50,000 people, an enormous population for that era. Uruk was dominated by two massive temple complexes, one dedicated to the sky god An and one to the goddess Inanna, and it was in the context of temple administration that writing first developed. The earliest texts we have are administrative records, tablets listing quantities of goods, deliveries of grain and livestock, allocations of resources to workers and priests. At first, the script was purely pictographic, with each symbol directly representing a concrete object, a cow, a jar of oil, a measure of barley, a human head to indicate a person. But within just a few centuries, the Sumerians had developed something far more sophisticated and far more powerful as a tool for communication. They began using symbols to represent not just objects but sounds, phonetic values, syllables that could be combined to write any word in the language. They developed symbols for abstract concepts that couldn't be easily drawn, ideas like kingship, justice, wisdom, sorrow. They created grammatical markers to indicate tense, number, case relationships between words. This phonetic and grammatical component allowed them to write anything they could speak, to record not just inventories and transactions, but poetry and prayers, myths and histories, personal letters and philosophical reflections. Writing became the foundation of civilization itself, the technology that enabled the accumulation and transmission of knowledge across generations, that allowed laws to be codified and consistently applied, that made possible the administration of large territorial states, that permitted the development of literature and scholarship and science as disciplines that could build on the work of previous generations rather than starting fresh with each new teacher. These clay tablets, once inscribed and then baked hard in the sun, or fired in kilns to make them permanent, became nearly indestructible time capsules, far more durable than any other ancient writing material. Clay is one of the most durable substances ever used for writing, vastly superior to papyrus, parchment, paper, wood, or silk. While parchments and papyrus crumbled to dust within centuries, disintegrating from humidity, insects, mold, and simple age, while wooden tablets rotted away in damp climates, or were consumed by termites, while silk scrolls dissolved when exposed to moisture, these clay documents endured virtually unchanged for thousands of years. They survived the collapse of empires, the Akkadian conquest of Sumer, the rise and fall of Babylon and Assyria, the Persian conquest, Alexander's campaigns, the Roman period, the Islamic conquest, the Mongol invasions. They survived the rise and fall of religions, the spread of Christianity and Islam, the complete abandonment of the old gods and the destruction of their temples. They survived the erasure of entire civilizations, the disappearance of languages, the forgetting of scripts, the loss of all memory of the cultures that created them. Fire, which destroys paper and wood and reduces parchment to ash, actually strengthens clay, baking it harder and making it more durable. Many tablets were accidentally preserved when the buildings housing them burned, the fire turning sun-dried clay into ceramic. Water, which dissolves papyrus and causes parchment to decompose, merely returns clay tablets to a soft state from which they can be dried again without loss of information. The Mesopotamian climate, hot and dry for much of the year with minimal rainfall, helped preserve these records in ways that the wetter regions of Europe or East Asia could never have managed. Tablets buried in the dry earth of Iraqi tells, the mounded ruins of ancient cities, remained readable for millennia, waiting for archaeologists to dig them up and scholars to decipher their messages. When archaeologists in the 19th century began systematically excavating the ruins of ancient Mesopotamian cities like Nineveh, Babylon, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and dozens of others, they unearthed thousands upon thousands of these tablets, eventually tens of thousands, ultimately hundreds of thousands. The discovery was staggering in its scope and implications, revolutionizing our understanding of ancient history and pushing back the documented past by thousands of years. Austen Henry Layard, a young British adventurer turned archaeologist, excavating the palace library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the mid-1800s, uncovered more than 30,000 tablets in what had been the royal library. These represented the collected wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization, accumulated over nearly 3,000 years, a library assembled by a king who sent scribes throughout his empire to copy every important text they could find, to gather knowledge from every source. Ashurbanipal, who reigned in the 7th century BCE from 668 to around 627 BCE, was himself literate, highly unusual for a king of any era. Most ancient rulers, even great conquerors and administrators, were illiterate, relying on scribes to read documents and record their words. But Ashurbanipal had been educated as a scholar before unexpectedly becoming king, and he valued knowledge and learning. He boasted in his inscriptions that he could read tablets from before the flood, meaning very ancient Sumerian texts written in an archaic script that even most scribes of his time couldn't decipher. His library became the single most important source for our understanding of Mesopotamian literature and religion, preserving texts that would otherwise have been lost forever when Nineveh was destroyed by the Medes and Babylonians in 612 BCE. Most tablets recovered from archaeological excavations contained mundane records of everyday life, the bureaucratic paperwork of ancient civilizations, documents that are individually unremarkable but collectively invaluable for understanding how these societies actually functioned. We have grain shipments recorded in meticulous detail, showing how much barley was delivered from which fields, how much was allocated to temple personnel, how much was stored in granaries for future use. We have tax receipts listing exactly what each farmer owed and paid. We have legal contracts for the sale of land, houses, slaves, and livestock, with witnesses named and thumbprints or cylinder seal impressions serving as signatures. We have marriage agreements spelling out dowries and bride prices, specifying what property a woman would bring to the marriage and what she would receive if widowed or divorced. We have adoption, papers, loan documents with interest rates clearly stated, court judgments settling disputes over property boundaries or inheritance rights, apprenticeship contracts, rental agreements, and countless other examples of the paperwork that complex societies generate. These everyday documents give us an incredibly detailed picture of how ancient Mesopotamian society actually functioned at the practical level of daily life. We know how much a slave cost, typically 20 to 30 shekels of silver depending on age, health and skills, about the same price as a decent donkey. We know how marriage contracts were negotiated, with families bargaining over bride price, what the groom's family paid to the bride's family, and dowry, what the bride brought with her into the marriage. We know how property was inherited, usually divided among sons with a double share going to the eldest, though daughters could inherit under certain circumstances. We know how courts settled disputes, with cases brought before assemblies of elders or appointed judges who heard testimony, examined evidence and rendered verdicts that were then recorded in writing. We know how temples managed their vast estates, which included thousands of acres of farmland, orchards, workshops, and employed armies of workers including farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, slaves, and priests. But some tablets contain something far more extraordinary than grain receipts and legal contracts, something that speaks to the religious imagination and theological speculation of these ancient peoples. Some told stories of gods and creation, elaborate myths explaining how the world came to be and how humanity originated. They described cosmic battles between primordial deities, the forces of chaos fighting against the forces of order. They recounted floods and catastrophes that reshaped the world, divine judgments that nearly exterminated humanity. Most intriguingly for our purposes tonight, they spoke of beings that came down from the heavens and changed everything. Divine or semi-divine figures who descended to earth, interacted with humans, taught them various arts and sciences, and fundamentally altered the course of human history. These mythological and religious texts, once translated and studied, revealed a sophisticated theology, a complex understanding of the divine realm and its relationship to the human world, and a disturbing account of events that allegedly occurred in the distant past when heaven and earth were more closely connected. The process of deciphering cuneiform was itself a fascinating story of scholarly detective work, international cooperation, brilliant insights, and painstaking effort spread across multiple generations. The script had been completely forgotten by the time of Christ. The last person who could read Akkadian cuneiform died sometime in the 1st century CE, and the last person who could read Sumerian had died centuries earlier. The scripts passed into total oblivion for nearly 2,000 years, becoming mysterious marks that no one could interpret. When European travellers in the 17th and 18th centuries encountered the strange wedge-shaped markings on ruins in Persia and Mesopotamia, carved into rock faces and inscribed on bricks, they had no idea what they were looking at. Some thought they were merely decorative patterns, ornamental designs rather than writing. Others speculated they might be writing of some kind but had no idea how to approach deciphering them, no Rosetta Stone equivalent to provide a bilingual key. The breakthrough came in the early 19th century when a brilliant young German teacher named Georg Friedrich Grotefend made the first successful attempts at deciphering Old Persian cuneiform. Working with copies of royal inscriptions from Persepolis, he used educated guesses about the names and titles of Persian kings to crack the code. He figured out which cuneiform signs represented which sounds, by assuming that certain repeated groups of signs must represent the names Darius and Xerxes, kings whose names he knew from Greek historical sources. Once he had identified those names, he could work out the phonetic values of the signs used to write them, and begin deciphering other words. His work was incomplete and contained errors, but it established the basic principle that would guide all future decipherment: the recognition that these signs represented sounds, not ideas or objects, and that the inscriptions were written in a language related to later Persian. But Old Persian cuneiform was relatively simple, using only 42 signs, and was only one of 3 languages that appeared in the famous Behistun inscription, a massive trilingual text carved into a cliff face in western Iran by the Persian king Darius the Great, around 520 BCE. The inscription, which celebrated Darius's victories over his enemies, was written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, 3 completely different languages using variations of cuneiform script. Old Persian was an Indo-European language ancestral to modern Farsi. Elamite was a language isolate spoken in southwestern Iran with no known relatives. Babylonian was a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic. The other 2 languages and their scripts were much more complex than Old Persian, using hundreds of signs with multiple possible readings depending on context. An English officer and diplomat named Henry Rawlinson, working in Persia in the 1830s and 1840s, spent years copying the Behistun inscription under extraordinarily dangerous conditions. The inscription was carved high up on a cliff face, hundreds of feet above the ground, accessible only by climbing narrow ledges with a sheer drop below. Rawlinson and his assistants had to hang from ropes to copy the text, working in blistering heat, at constant risk of falling to their deaths. One of his Kurdish assistants, actually, did fall while trying to reach the most difficult section, saved only by landing in bushes that broke his fall. But Rawlinson persevered, eventually producing complete copies of all 3 versions of the inscription. His copies, combined with Grotefend's pioneering work and contributions from other scholars in France, Germany, and England, eventually allowed the decipherment of Babylonian cuneiform, opening up vast new vistas of ancient history. And once scholars could read Babylonian, an Akkadian dialect, they could work backward to Sumerian, the even older language that Akkadian scribes had learned as a classical tongue, much as medieval Europeans learned Latin centuries after it had ceased to be anyone's native language. Sumerian had stopped being spoken as a living language by around 1800 BCE, but it continued to be used for religious and scholarly texts for another 1500 years, studied by scribes who created bilingual Sumerian Akkadian, dictionaries, grammatical texts, and sign lists to help students learn this ancient sacred language. These bilingual texts became the key that modern scholars use to unlock Sumerian, comparing the Sumerian text with its Akkadian translation, slowly working out meanings, grammatical structures, and the reading of signs that had multiple possible values depending on context. The Sumerian language itself is what linguists call a language isolate, meaning it has no known relatives, no other languages that can be demonstrated to be genetically related to it as members of the same language family. It's not Semitic like Akkadian, Hebrew, Arabic, or Aramaic. It's not Indo-European like English, Greek, Sanskrit, or Persian. It's not related to any language family we can currently identify. Some speculative theories have tried to connect it to Turkish, Finnish, or various other language families, but none of these proposals have gained scholarly acceptance. This isolation makes Sumerian exceptionally difficult to understand. Scholars had to learn it from scratch, without the benefit of comparison with related languages, using only bilingual Sumerian-Akkadian dictionaries that ancient scribes had created, comparing word lists, analysing grammar patterns, and slowly piecing together the meaning of thousands of signs and sign combinations through context and comparison across many texts. What they discovered shocked the academic world and revolutionized our understanding of the ancient Near East. These weren't primitive myths from ignorant ancients fumbling toward understanding in a pre-scientific age, simple stories told around campfires by people who couldn't comprehend natural phenomena. These were sophisticated narratives crafted by skilled poets, detailed cosmologies worked out by priestly scholars, complex theological systems that had been refined over thousands of years through generations of debate and reflection. The Sumerians had developed advanced mathematics that in some ways surpassed what would come later. They used both a decimal system based on 10 and a sexagesimal system based on 60, the latter being particularly useful for astronomical calculations because 60 can be evenly divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. We still use their sexagesimal system today when we measure time in 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours, when we divide circles into 360 degrees, when we reckon latitude and longitude in degrees, minutes, and seconds. They had sophisticated astronomy, tracking the movements of planets with remarkable precision over centuries, accumulating observational data that allowed them to predict eclipses, identify periodic comets, map the paths of Venus and other planets across the sky, and create star catalogues listing the positions of major stars and constellations. They identified the zodiac, dividing the sky into 12 regions associated with constellations and using these divisions for astrological predictions about national fate and royal fortunes. They understood that planets moved against the background of fixed stars, wandering across the zodiac in patterns that repeated over time. They knew that Venus appears as both morning star and evening star, not realizing these were the same object but accurately tracking its appearances and disappearances. They identified and named 5 visible planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, associating each with a particular deity from their pantheon. They understood hydraulic engineering at a sophisticated level, building complex irrigation systems that transformed the arid Mesopotamian plain into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world. The region receives little rainfall, far too little for reliable farming, but it has 2 great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, that flood annually carrying water from the mountains of Turkey and Armenia. The Sumerians and their successors built an elaborate network of canals, dikes, reservoirs, and sluice gates to control and distribute this water, irrigating vast fields of barley and wheat, date palm groves and vegetable gardens. This required sophisticated engineering, careful surveying to ensure water flowed in the right direction, constant maintenance to prevent canals from silting up, and complex social organization to coordinate the labor of thousands of workers and fairly distribute water among competing users. They created detailed law codes that governed every aspect of social life, the most famous being the Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, around 1700 BCE, a collection of 282 laws carved onto a black stone stele nearly 8 feet tall, and still perfectly preserved in the Louvre Museum in Paris. But earlier Sumerian law codes existed as well, including the Code of Ur-Nammu from around 2100 BCE, the oldest surviving law code in the world. These legal systems addressed everything from property rights and boundaries to personal injury compensation, from marriage and divorce to slavery and adoption, from contract law governing loans and sales to criminal justice, specifying punishments for theft, assault, murder, and other crimes. They operated on sophisticated legal principles including the presumption of testimony under oath, the right to present evidence and witnesses, proportional punishment often following the principle of equivalent retaliation, and the use of monetary compensation as an alternative to physical punishment in many cases. They organized society with bureaucratic efficiency that would not be seen again until the Roman Empire more than 2,000 years later. They created professional administrators who managed temple estates, collected taxes, organized labor crews for public works, maintained granaries and arsenals, and kept detailed records of everything. They established scribal schools called adubus, literally tablet houses, where boys from wealthy families trained for years to master the complex cuneiform script, learning thousands of signs and their various readings, memorizing long lists of Sumerian words with their Akkadian equivalents, copying out classic literary texts, practicing mathematical problems, and studying model legal documents and letters. These schools produced a literate elite capable of running the administrative apparatus of increasingly complex states. Temples functioned as economic centers that rivaled or exceeded royal palaces in wealth and power. They owned vast agricultural estates worked by dependent laborers, employed thousands of workers in workshops producing textiles, pottery, metalwork, and other goods. They lent money and grain at interest, renting out land and tools, keeping meticulous records of every shekel and bushel, and according to their own texts, according to the religious narratives that formed the foundation of their worldview and their understanding of human origins and purpose, much of this knowledge, much of this civilization, came from divine beings they called the Anunnaki. The word itself translates roughly to those who from heaven to earth came, a meaning supported by the Akkadian etymology, though some scholars pass it differently as royal offspring or offspring of the prince. The Sumerian phrase appears in several forms including Danunna, Danunnakene, or simply Anunnaki, with slight variations in how the term is written and pronounced across different periods and dialects. These phonetic variations represent the same concept, a specific class of divine beings distinguished from other categories of gods and spirits. These beings were described as the children of An, the sky god whose name literally means heaven or sky, or Anu in the Akkadian language that succeeded and eventually replaced Sumerian as the dominant language of Mesopotamia. The Anunnaki were said to be a council of powerful deities who descended from the heavens in the distant past, in the days before history when the world was being established, when cities were founded and civilization was taking shape. They established the first cities according to Sumerian tradition, locations that appear again and again in the mythological texts as centers of divine activity and human culture. They founded kingship as an institution, the system of monarchical rule that would dominate Mesopotamian politics for 3,000 years. The Sumerian king list, a text that purports to list every king who ruled in Sumer from the beginning of time, opens with the statement that kingship descended from heaven, that it was not a human invention but a divine gift, a form of government instituted by the gods themselves. This divine origin gave Mesopotamian kings their legitimacy and authority, presenting them not as human strongmen who had seized power by force, but as chosen representatives of the divine order appointed to rule on behalf of the gods. The Anunnaki taught humanity the arts of agriculture and irrigation according to the myths, transforming hunter-gatherers into farmers, wild foragers into civilized cultivators. They revealed the secrets of writing and mathematics, gifts of inestimable value that made possible all higher forms of culture and learning. They instituted law and government, establishing the principles of justice and the mechanisms of administration that allowed large populations to live together in relative peace and prosperity. They generally transformed primitive hunter-gatherers living in small bands into civilized urban dwellers inhabiting great cities, participants in complex societies with specialized occupations, social hierarchies, accumulated wealth, monumental architecture, artistic traditions, and literary cultures. This transformation, what archaeologists call the urban revolution or the rise of civilization, happened remarkably quickly. In Mesopotamia, suggesting to the ancient Sumerians that it must have been divinely inspired and divinely directed, rather than a purely human development emerging gradually through trial and error. The Anunnaki appear throughout Sumerian literature as the supreme divine council, the highest assembly of gods who held ultimate authority over both heaven and earth, whose decisions shaped the fate of individuals, cities, kingdoms, and the entire cosmos. They were the judges of fate, determining the destiny of every person at birth, assigning each soul its portion of good fortune or suffering, long life or early death, prosperity or poverty. They were the deciders of destinies in a collective sense as well, meeting in assembly to determine the fate of nations, which kings would triumph and which would fall, which cities would prosper and which would be destroyed, whether there would be peace or war, abundance or famine, justice or oppression. They were the legislators of cosmic law, the divine powers who established the fundamental principles by which the universe operates, what the Sumerians called the Me, pronounced May, a concept that has no exact English equivalent, but encompasses something like the fundamental laws and powers and institutions that make civilization possible. Every new year, according to Mesopotamian belief, the Anunnaki would meet in council in the great temple at Nippur, the religious capital of Sumer, to decree the fate of humanity for the coming year. This wasn't seen as arbitrary divine whim, but as a solemn assembly following proper procedures, hearing arguments, weighing evidence, and rendering judgments based on justice, though also on the gods' own interests and conflicts. The decisions made in this assembly would determine who would live and die in the coming year, who would prosper and who would suffer, which cities would flourish and which would fall, whether the rivers would flood properly or fail, whether the rains would come or the land would suffer drought, whether there would be peace or war, plenty or famine, health or plague. Human kings and priests would offer sacrifices and prayers trying to influence these divine deliberations, to win favor with the gods and secure positive decrees for their cities and people, but ultimately the power lay with the Anunnaki, whose will could not be definitively controlled by human action, however pious. This concept of divine assembly making collective decisions about human affairs, rather than a single god decreeing whatever he wished, was central to Mesopotamian religion, and would later influence biblical concepts of the divine council, mentioned in Psalms, the Book of Job, and other Hebrew scriptures. Psalm 82 opens with the declaration that God stands in the divine assembly, in the midst of the gods, and proceeds to judge them for unjust rule, pronouncing sentence upon them. The Book of Job describes how the sons of God present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan comes among them to accuse Job. 1 Kings 22 describes the prophet Micaiah having a vision of Yahweh sitting on his throne, with the host of heaven standing on his right and on his left, debating how to entice King Ahab to his doom. These biblical passages reflect a similar conception of divine governance involving multiple divine beings making collective decisions. Though in the Hebrew Bible Yahweh is clearly supreme, over all other divine beings in a way that never quite was over the other Anunnaki. In the earliest texts dating to around 2100 BCE during the reign of Gudea and the third dynasty of Ur, the Anunnaki are explicitly named as the most powerful and important deities in the Sumerian pantheon, the gods who truly mattered in determining the fate of cities and kingdoms. Gudea, the Ensi or ruler of the city-state of Lagash, left numerous inscriptions describing his piety toward the gods and his building projects undertaken on behalf of the Anunnaki to honor them and secure their favor. He built temples to multiple members of the Divine Council, massive ziggurats and elaborate shrine complexes decorated with precious materials imported from distant lands. He sought their guidance through dreams and omens, describing how the gods appeared to him in visions, giving him instructions and promises. In one famous account inscribed on 2 large clay cylinders, Gudea describes a dream in which the god Ningirsu, the patron deity of Lagash, appeared to him as a giant whose crown touched heaven and whose feet rested on earth, commanding him to build a temple. Gudea didn't understand the dream at first and sought interpretation from the goddess Nanshi, a deity associated with dreams and prophecy. She explained the vision and told him how to proceed, what rituals to perform, what materials to gather, how to orient the building. Gudea then spent years assembling materials from throughout the known world: cedars from Lebanon, diorite from Magan in Oman, gold from Meluha, possibly the Indus Valley, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, all transported to Lagash by boat and caravan to create a temple worthy of the gods. His cylinder inscriptions describe this process in elaborate poetic detail, expressing his devotion and the great effort required to please the gods. These texts presented Gudea as the ideal ruler, pious and obedient to divine authority, wise enough to seek guidance, powerful enough to mobilize resources, successful in securing the favor of the gods for his city and people. The texts speak of 7 great Anunnaki, though the exact composition of this group shifts somewhat depending on the source, time period and city, reflecting the complex political and religious geography of Mesopotamia, where different urban centers favored different deities as supreme. Different cities had different patron gods who were considered most important in that particular location, and religious supremacy often followed political power, with the god of a conquering city rising in importance across the region. Generally, however, when texts speak of the 7 great Anunnaki, they included An or Anu, the supreme sky god whose name literally means heaven or sky in Sumerian. He was the father of the gods in a genealogical sense, the progenitor from whom other deities descended. His temple in Uruk, the Iana temple complex shared with his daughter or granddaughter Inanna, was one of the most important religious centers in Sumer, a massive structure rebuilt and expanded multiple times over thousands of years. An was the ultimate authority in theory, the highest god whose word was final, but in practice he remained distant and aloof, rarely intervening directly in earthly affairs or even in the conflicts among the gods themselves. He dwelt in the highest heaven, remote from the concerns of mortals and even from most divine matters, appearing in myths mainly to ratify decisions made by more active gods or to arbitrate disputes that others couldn't resolve. This pattern of a supreme deity who is theoretically ultimate but practically inactive appears in many ancient mythologies, perhaps reflecting the political structure of early states where kings often reigned but didn't directly rule, leaving actual governance to deputies and administrators. Enlil, the god of air, wind, breath, and earth, was often described as the most active and powerful of the gods despite An's theoretical supremacy. His name means Lord of the Air or Lord of the Wind, and he was associated with the space between heaven and earth, the atmosphere where weather occurs, where winds blow, where breath sustains life. He was described as separating heaven and earth in creation myths, carving out the space where humans could exist, pushing the sky upward and pressing the earth downward to create the habitable world between. His cult center was Nippur, which was considered the religious capital of Sumer even during periods when it had little or no political power. Nippur was never a major political center, never the capital of a great kingdom, never ruled by a dynasty of powerful kings. Yet every Mesopotamian ruler sought legitimacy by honoring Enlil at Nippur, by making offerings at his temple, by rebuilding and embellishing his shrine. To control Nippur was to have divine sanction for rule, even if one had conquered Nippur by force. Enlil was the god who granted kingship, who decreed which dynasty would rule and for how long. He was also the god most associated with divine justice and judgment, both for good and ill. He rewarded the righteous and punished the wicked, but he could also be harsh, even brutal in executing judgment, destroying cities that offended him, sending floods and plagues, decreeing the downfall of kings who displeased him. Enki or Ea, the god of wisdom, fresh water, magic, crafts, and creation, was the clever deity who often helped humanity in myths, the divine patron who looked favorably on humans and frequently intervened to protect them from the wrath of other gods. His name in Sumerian, Enki, means Lord of the Earth or Lord of the Ground. while his Akkadian name Ea is of uncertain etymology, but may be related to a word for house of water. He was associated with the Abzu, the underground ocean of fresh water that the Mesopotamians believed existed beneath the earth, feeding all springs, rivers, and wells. The Abzu was both a place and a deity, the primordial fresh water that existed before creation, and Enki's temple in the city of Eridu was built over a spring, a direct connection to the underground waters. Eridu, located in the far south of Mesopotamia near the marshes where the Euphrates approaches the Persian Gulf, was considered by Sumerian tradition to be the oldest city in the world, the first place where civilization emerged, the first location where kingship descended from heaven. Enki was a creator god, who in various myths formed humanity from clay mixed with divine blood, or who instructed the mother goddess Ninhursag in the process of human creation. He was a trickster figure in some stories, using cleverness and deception to achieve his goals when strength wouldn't work. He was the benefactor of humanity who taught humans various arts and crafts, who gave them agriculture and irrigation, who revealed to them the secrets of writing and mathematics. He was also the god who saved humanity from destruction in the Mesopotamian flood myth, warning the Sumerian Noah figure Zeus-Sudra, or his Akkadian equivalent Atrahasis about the coming deluge, instructing him to build a boat and save himself, his family, and representatives of all living things. Enki was the master of magic and secret knowledge, the god who understood the fundamental workings of the universe, who knew all mysteries and could manipulate reality through spells and incantations. His priests were skilled in magic, medicine, and divination, serving as healers, exorcists, and interpreters of omens. Ninhursag, or Ki, the Earth Mother Goddess, was the Great Mother of all living things, the divine force of fertility and nourishment. Her name means Lady of the Mountain, or more literally Lady of the Sacred Mountain, associating her with mountains as sources of life-giving water and minerals. She had many names and manifestations, including Ninmah, meaning exalted lady, Nintu, meaning lady who gives birth, Mama or Mamu, and various others. She was associated with fertility in all its forms, the fertility of crops growing from earth, of flocks and herds multiplying, of women conceiving and bearing children, of cities expanding and prospering. In some texts she appears as Ki, the earth itself personified as female, the consort of the sky, their union representing the joining of heaven and earth from which all life proceeds. Various creation myths describe her role in forming humanity, shaping humans from clay, determining their nature and characteristics, establishing the patterns of birth and growth. Nana or Sin, the moon god, was considered more important than the sun in Mesopotamian religion, a priority that may seem strange to us, but made perfect sense in that cultural context. The moon's phases provided a convenient and visible calendar system, with the new moon marking the beginning of each month, the full moon marking its middle, and the moon's waning marking its end. The month was the basic unit of time for reckoning, not the week which didn't exist in ancient Mesopotamia, or the year which was more abstract. The moon's cool light was more welcome in the hot climate than the blazing sun that turned the land into an oven for half the year. Nana was the son of Enlil and Ninlil according to one myth cycle, making him a member of the third generation of gods. His primary cult center was the ancient city of Ur, where the great ziggurat of Ur-Nammu still stands today, a massive, stepped pyramid dedicated to the moon god, one of the best preserved ziggurats in Iraq despite 4,000 years of weathering. Utu or Shamash, the sun god, was the deity of light, truth, and justice, the all-seeing eye whose rays penetrated into every corner and illuminated all that was hidden. Every morning he emerged from the mountains in the east where the gates of heaven opened, and he travelled across the sky in his chariot drawn by supernatural donkeys or horses, seeing everything that happened on earth throughout the day. Because he saw all, because nothing could be hidden from his gaze, he became the patron deity of justice and truth, the god who exposed lies and punished wrongdoing. Judges invoked his name when pronouncing verdicts, calling on Shamash to witness that their judgments were fair and truthful. Oaths were sworn by Shamash, essentially daring the god to strike dead anyone who swore falsely, knowing the sun god saw the truth and would punish perjury. His temples included spaces where legal disputes were settled, where contracts were witnessed and sealed, where official business was conducted under the watchful eye of the divine judge. In some myths, Shamash appears as a champion of justice who intervenes to protect the innocent and punish the guilty, while in others he simply observes, his very observation serving to keep humans honest, knowing they live under divine surveillance. And Inanna or Ishtar, the goddess of love, beauty, sex, fertility, and war, was one of the most complex and contradictory deities in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon, simultaneously representing the life-giving power of sexual love and procreation and the death-dealing violence of warfare and conquest. She was associated with the planet Venus, the brightest object in the sky after the sun and moon, which appears as both morning star and evening star, visible just before dawn and just after sunset. This dual appearance was linked to her dual nature, both creative and destructive, both tender and brutal, both nurturing and violent. She was the goddess of sexual desire, of the attraction between men and women that leads to reproduction, of the pleasure of physical love, of the beauty that inspires desire. Her temples employed sacred prostitutes, both female and male, whose sexual services were understood as acts of worship that connected participants to the divine forces of fertility. But she was also the goddess of war, depicted in art armed with weapons, her foot on a defeated enemy, associated with the violence of battle and conquest. Her most famous myth describes her descent to the underworld, a narrative that was one of the most important and widely copied texts in Mesopotamian literature, existing in both Sumerian and Akkadian versions with slight variations. In this story, Inanna decides to descend to the underworld realm ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, the Queen of the Dead. Her motives vary across versions, but generally involve either attending the funeral of Ereshkigal's husband or attempting to usurp her sister's throne and extend her own power into the realm of death. She descends through 7 gates, and at each gate she must remove one piece of clothing and jewelry, arriving naked and powerless before her sister's throne. The Anunnaki, serving as judges of the dead, pass judgment on her for her presumption. She is killed, and her corpse is hung on a hook like a piece of meat in a butcher shop. After 3 days, servants that Inanna had prudently instructed to rescue her if she didn't return managed to negotiate her release through various means depending on the version, and she is resurrected and returns to the upper world. The myth was interpreted in multiple ways, as a vegetation myth explaining the cycle of seasons, as a story about royal succession, as a narrative about the inevitability of death even for gods, and as a theological statement about the power of the underworld and the necessary balance between life and death. These 7 gods, An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nanna, Utu, and Inanna, were the cosmic legislators, the architects of order in both the divine and human realms, the powers that established and maintained the fundamental structures of reality. But different cities and different time periods sometimes included different deities in the group of 7, or gave different rankings to the gods based on local preferences and political circumstances. The flexibility of the pantheon reflected the political reality of Mesopotamia, which was never unified under a single government for very long. The region consisted of competing city-states, each independent and often hostile to its neighbours, each with its own patron deity who was naturally considered supreme by that city's inhabitants. When one city conquered others, its god rose in importance and prestige, sometimes absorbing the attributes and worship of defeated gods, sometimes being equated with them, as different names for the same divine power. Ningirsu, a warrior god closely associated with or identified with Enlil's son Ninurta, was especially emphasized in the city of Lagash, where Gudea's inscriptions lavish praise and devotion on this deity above all others. Marduk, originally a local agricultural god of the city of Babylon, rose to supreme importance in Babylonian religion as Babylon itself rose to political dominance. By the time of the Babylonian Empire in the early 2nd millennium BCE, Marduk had been elevated to the position of king of the gods, his supremacy established in the Enuma Elish creation epic, where he defeats the primordial chaos monster Tiamat and creates the universe from her corpse. Later Babylonian theology went even further, declaring that all other gods were merely aspects or manifestations of Marduk, that names like Enlil, Enki, Nana, and Shamash all referred to different powers or attributes of the one supreme god Marduk. This was a form of henotheism, or even approaching monotheism, acknowledging multiple divine names while asserting they all ultimately refer to one deity. Nabu, the god of writing and wisdom, patron of scribes and scholars, rose to prominence in the 1st millennium BCE, especially in Assyrian religion. He was the son of Marduk according to Babylonian theology, and his cult center was the city of Bossipa near Babylon. As literacy and scholarship became increasingly important for running complex imperial states, Nabu's importance grew correspondingly. Kings presented themselves as his faithful servants, as wise rulers who valued learning and preserved ancient knowledge. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king whose library preserved so much of Mesopotamian literature, was particularly devoted to Nabu and boasted of his own scholarly accomplishments under the god's tutelage. But the Anunnaki as a collective group, regardless of which specific gods were counted in their number, remained central to Mesopotamian religion throughout its 3,000-year history. They were the powers that ruled the cosmos, the assembly that decreed destiny, the judges who determined the fate of individuals and nations, the divine authorities to whom kings owed their thrones and cities owed their prosperity. But the Anunnaki were not the only divine beings in the Mesopotamian cosmos. Ancient texts also mention the Igigi, a class of younger gods who initially performed the labor of maintaining creation, the manual work necessary to keep the universe functioning. The relationship between Anunnaki and Igigi is complex and varies across different texts and time periods, never achieving complete consistency. In some accounts, the Igigi were subordinate deities who carried out the will of the great Anunnaki, serving as their workers and agents much as humans serve the gods. They were lesser divine beings, lower in rank and power, but still immortal and supernatural. In other texts, Igigi seems to be simply another name for the Anunnaki themselves, or at least for some subgroup of them, perhaps the Anunnaki who dwell in heaven, as opposed to those associated with earth or underworld. The Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish describes how the victorious god Marduk organized the cosmos after his defeat of Tiamat by assigning 300 Anunnaki to watch over the heavens and 300 to watch over the earth, for a total of 600 divine administrators responsible for maintaining order in the universe. These 600 are sometimes identified with the Igigi, the divine workforce that keeps creation functioning, performing the endless tasks necessary to maintain cosmic order. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the most important Mesopotamian myths, and one we'll discuss in detail shortly, the Igigi gods are described as growing weary of the back-breaking labor required to maintain the world. They had to dig canals for irrigation, dredge rivers to keep them navigable, build and maintain dikes to control flooding, clear fields, plant crops, tend flocks, and perform all the physical work of agriculture, construction, and resource extraction. This was exhausting, endless toil with no rest, no retirement, no relief. After 40 years of this grinding labor, 40 years being a symbolic number representing a long period of suffering, they could take no more. Their patience exhausted, their bodies worn out, their spirits broken by the relentless drudgery, they rebelled. They burned their work tools, symbols of their oppression, in great bonfires. They surrounded the house of Enlil, the god who had assigned them their tasks, with fire and torches, essentially staging a siege or protest. They demanded relief, insisting they could no longer continue under such conditions. The great gods, the Anunnaki proper who did not labor themselves, held an emergency council to decide what to do about this divine labor crisis. They couldn't simply destroy the Igigi, who were divine beings and therefore immortal, incapable of being killed in any conventional sense. Such drastic action would also leave them without workers, unable to maintain the universe. But they also couldn't continue to function without workers to perform all the necessary tasks. The solution proposed by Enki, the clever god who often found ways to solve seemingly insoluble problems, was to create a new species that could take over the work, beings who would be mortal and therefore manageable, capable of labor but also expendable, not divine but intelligent enough to understand instructions and perform complex tasks. This new species would be humanity. The gods would create humans specifically to serve as workers, to take over the burden of maintaining creation so the divine Igigi could rest. This is the Mesopotamian answer to a fundamental theological question. Why did the gods create humans? Not out of love or loneliness, not to populate the universe or have worshippers, but for an entirely practical purpose, to perform labor that the gods didn't want to do themselves. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic dating to around 1700 BCE, or possibly slightly earlier, describes how the primordial waters of Apsu, representing fresh water, and Tiamat, representing salt water, mingled in the beginning to birth the first generation of gods. This is cosmogony as generation, creation through divine reproduction, rather than through command or craftsmanship. In the beginning, according to this text, there was nothing but these two primordial waters in a chaotic, undifferentiated state. Apsu and Tiamat were not just bodies of water, but divine persons, conscious beings who existed in the abyss before creation. They were the first things, the original divine powers from whom everything else would descend. From their union, from the mingling of fresh and salt water, came the first generation of younger gods, Lamu and Lahamu, whose names may mean muddy, referring to silt that forms when fresh and salt water mix. From Lahmu and Lahamu came Anshar and Kishar, representing the horizons of heaven and earth. From Anshar and Kishar came Anu, the sky god, and from Anu came Ea or Enki, the clever god of wisdom and fresh water. Each younger generation of gods was more energetic, more active, more noisy than the last. The younger gods made noise, they moved about, they stirred up the primordial waters, they disturbed the peace that had existed in the original chaos. This noise and activity bothered Apsu, who wanted quiet and rest. He couldn't sleep because of the constant commotion made by his divine offspring. He complained to Tiamat about this unbearable situation, proposing that they should destroy the younger gods so that peace could return and he could finally rest. Tiamat initially resisted this idea, reluctant to destroy her own children, but Apsu was determined to restore quiet whatever the cost. He made plans to annihilate the younger gods, planning a surprise attack that would eliminate them before they could resist. But the clever god Ea learned of this plot through his supernatural wisdom. He understood that Apsu intended to destroy all the younger gods, and he devised a plan to protect them. Ea composed a magical spell of tremendous power and cast it upon Apsu. The spell put the primordial god into a deep, unbreakable sleep, unconscious and helpless. While Apsu slept, Ea stripped off his crown and his aura, the visible signs of his divine power and authority. Then Ea killed the sleeping Apsu, slaying the primordial freshwater god and taking his place. Ea established his dwelling upon Apsu's corpse, building his temple on the vanquished body of the primordial deity. This theme of establishing order by defeating and building upon primordial chaos would be repeated in the next generation. Ea and his consort Damkina had a son in this new dwelling built on Apsu's body. This son was Marduk, who would become the supreme god of Babylon and the champion of the younger gods. Marduk was magnificent from birth, the text says, surpassing all other gods in appearance, ability, and power. He had 4 eyes that saw in all directions simultaneously, 4 ears that heard everything, flames shot from his mouth when he spoke. He was perfect in every way, the ultimate divine warrior. Meanwhile, Tiamat learned that her consort Apsu had been killed. She was enraged by this murder, determined to avenge him. She decided to do what she had initially resisted, destroy the younger gods who had brought only trouble. But where Apsu had planned to act alone, Tiamat assembled an army. She created 11 monsters to serve as her forces, terrifying hybrid creatures of chaos: the Hydra, the Dragon, the Great Lion, the Mad Dog, the Scorpion Man, demons and storms and hybrid beasts. She made Kingu, one of the original gods, the leader of her army, and gave him the Tablet of Destinies, the divine object that granted its holder supreme authority over the universe. The younger gods were terrified when they learned that Tiamat was coming with her army of monsters. None of them wanted to face her. She was primordial chaos, the original divine power, immensely more powerful than any individual younger god. Ea, who had defeated Apsu, couldn't defeat Tiamat. Anu tried to face her but turned back in fear before even engaging in combat. The situation seemed hopeless. The younger gods faced annihilation with no champion capable of saving them. Then Marduk stepped forward. He was willing to fight Tiamat, but he demanded a price for this service. If he defeated Tiamat and saved the gods, he wanted to be made supreme king of the pantheon. His word would be law. His commands would be unquestioned. The gods would grant him all authority, making him their permanent ruler. The desperate gods agreed to his terms. They held an assembly, got drunk on beer and wine, and formally proclaimed Marduk as their king, giving him the authority he demanded. Marduk armed himself for battle. He took a bow and arrows, carried a mace, wielded lightning, created wind and storms, fashioned a great net to trap his enemy. Then he set out to face Tiamat. The battle was cosmic in scale, the forces of order and chaos meeting in ultimate confrontation. Tiamat opened her mouth to swallow Marduk, but he drove the winds into her mouth, inflating her body until she couldn't close it. Then he shot an arrow down her throat, piercing her heart and killing her. With Tiamat dead, her monstrous army fled in terror, but Marduk caught them all in his net. He bound them as prisoners, stripping them of their power. He took the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu and placed it on his own chest, claiming supreme authority over the cosmos. Then Marduk turned to Tiamat's corpse and began the work of creation. He split her body in half like a shellfish. One half he lifted up to become the sky, setting guards to make sure her waters didn't escape. The other half he used to create the earth. From her body he fashioned all the features of the universe. From her eyes flowed the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. From her breasts he made mountains. From her various parts he created all the geography of the world. He established the positions of the stars, setting gods in the heavens to mark the days and months and years. He organized the cosmos into an ordered system, with regular patterns and predictable cycles. The universe was creation from chaos, order imposed upon primordial disorder through violence and divine will. But creation wasn't complete. The gods still needed workers to maintain everything Marduk had established. They brought before Marduk the captured rebel god King, who had led Tiamat's army. King was executed, his blood was mixed with clay, and from this mixture the wise god Ea fashioned humanity. The text is explicit about this. Humans were created from the blood of a rebel god, from a divine being who had fought against the established order. This origin explained human nature from the Mesopotamian perspective. Humans have something divine in them, the blood of a god, which gives them intelligence and consciousness. But they also have something rebellious and chaotic in them, inherited from King who opposed divine authority. Humans are capable of wisdom but prone to rebellion, intelligent but troublesome, able to maintain order but always threatening to disrupt it. The purpose of human creation, according to the Enuma Elish, was explicitly to free the gods from labor. Ea fashioned humans and imposed on them the service of the gods. Humanity was created specifically to work, to till fields, tend flocks, dig canals, build temples, offer sacrifices, and generally maintain the universe so the gods could rest and be worshipped. This wasn't presented as cruel or unjust, but simply as the natural order of things. Gods were meant to rule and be served. Humans were meant to work and worship. Each had their place in the cosmic hierarchy. Humans who accepted their role and served the gods faithfully could expect divine protection and blessing. Those who rebelled or neglected their duties would face divine wrath. The myth established the religious ideology that justified Mesopotamian society. Kings ruled by divine appointment, priests mediated between gods and humans, workers labored to support temples and palaces, and everyone had their assigned role in maintaining the cosmic order established by Marduk's victory over chaos. The Atrahasis epic, another crucial Mesopotamian creation text composed sometime before 1700 BCE, tells a similar but more detailed story about human creation, focusing specifically on the labor crisis that led to humanity's origin. The title Atrahasis means exceedingly wise, and refers to the Noah figure who survives the flood. The epic begins with a division of the universe among the gods. Anu took the heaven for his domain. Enlil took the earth. Enki took the waters below the earth, the Apsu. Under Enlil's supervision, the Igigi gods were assigned the task of maintaining the earth. They had to dig the beds of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, dredge them to keep them flowing properly, build canals for irrigation, construct dikes and reservoirs to control flooding. This was backbreaking labor performed with simple tools in brutal heat, endless work with no respite. The text describes their suffering in detail. For 40 years the Igigi dug waterways and maintained the irrigation systems, working day and night. They grew exhausted, their bodies broken, their spirits crushed by the relentless toil. They began complaining among themselves about the unbearable conditions. Finally, they couldn't take it anymore. One night they gathered together and decided to rebel. They burned their spades and baskets, the tools that symbolized their oppression. They armed themselves and marched on Enlil's house, surrounding it with fire, demanding that he come out and address their grievances. This was a divine labor strike, a cosmic workers' revolt against unfair conditions and exploitation. Enlil was terrified by this uprising. He sent word to Anu and Ea, summoning them to council to decide how to respond to the Igigi's rebellion. The three great gods debated what to do. They couldn't simply crush the rebellion by force. Without workers, the universe couldn't be maintained. But they couldn't allow divine beings to continue in such miserable conditions either. The solution, proposed by Ea, was to create a substitute workforce. Let humans be created to bear the labor that was oppressing the Igigi. Mami, the mother goddess, also called Nintu or Ninhursag, would create humans with Ea's assistance. The process of creation is described in fascinating and disturbing detail that shows how seriously the Mesopotamians took this myth. Mami decided she needed divine substance to create beings that would be intelligent enough to perform complex labor. One of the gods, Weila, was selected to be sacrificed for this purpose. The text doesn't say how this god was chosen or whether he volunteered or was forced, but he was killed and his blood was mixed with clay. Mami formed this mixture into humans, creating 7 males and 7 females initially. The text describes how she used birth rituals, how she counted months of gestation, how she performed rites to ensure the new beings would be viable. After 9 months of divine pregnancy, the first humans were born. They immediately began to reproduce, multiplying across the earth, taking over the labor that had burdened the Igigi. The gods finally had relief from toil. They could rest, be worshipped, receive offerings, and enjoy their divine status without exhausting labor. For 600 years, perhaps another symbolic number representing a long period, this arrangement worked well. Humans proliferated, filling the earth, farming the land, building cities, worshipping the gods. But then a problem emerged. Humans became too numerous and too noisy. Their racket disturbed Enlil's sleep, just as the younger god's noise had once disturbed Apsu. Enlil couldn't rest because of the constant din of human activity. He decided to reduce the human population. First, he sent a plague. The god Namtar, whose name means fate, or death, was dispatched to Earth to kill humans with disease. Large numbers died, but the survivors reproduced and population levels recovered. Then Enlil sent drought. The rains failed, crops withered, animals died, humans starved. Again, many perished, but the crisis passed and population recovered. Enlil tried drought again, making it more severe. Ea secretly helped humans survive by teaching them to dig deeper wells and find underground water. Each time Enlil tried to reduce human numbers, Ea would find a way to help at least some survive. Finally, Enlil decided on a more permanent solution, a great flood that would completely destroy humanity, wiping out the noisy creatures once and for all. The gods swore an oath not to reveal this plan to humanity. They would send the flood and wipe out every living human without warning. But Ea, always the friend of humanity, found a loophole in his oath. He couldn't directly tell a human about the coming flood, but he could tell a reed wall. So Ea went to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house and spoke to it, describing the plan for the flood and instructing on how to survive by building a boat. Atrahasis, sleeping on the other side of the wall, overheard this message. He understood that Ea was warning him indirectly, respecting the letter of his oath while violating its spirit. Atrahasis asked for clarification on what he should do. Ea told him, again speaking to the wall, to abandon his possessions, disregard material wealth, and focus on saving life. He should build a large boat, making it circular like a coracle, waterproofing it with pitch, loading it with grain and supplies, bringing aboard his family and representatives of all animal species. Atrahasis did exactly as instructed. He built the boat according to the specifications Ea provided. He loaded it with food, supplies, his family and animals of every kind. Then the flood came. The text describes it with terrifying imagery. The sky grew dark. The storm god Adad rumbled in the clouds. The gods who controlled water released all their reserves at once. Rain fell in torrents. Rivers overflowed their banks. The ocean surged inland. Water rose from below and fell from above simultaneously. For 7 days and 7 nights, the deluge continued without pause. The entire world was covered with water. Every human being on earth drowned except those in Atrahasis' boat. The gods themselves were terrified by the flood's ferocity. They cowered like dogs crouching in fear. The mother goddess Nintu wept, lamenting the destruction of her human children. She regretted agreeing to this plan, mourning that she had sanctioned such devastation. When the flood finally subsided and Atrahasis' boat grounded on a mountain, he emerged and offered sacrifice to the gods. The gods, who hadn't received offerings for the duration of the flood and were starving for worship, smelled the sweet savour of the sacrifice and gathered around it like flies, the text says, pushing and shoving to get close to the offering. Enlil arrived and was furious that any humans had survived. He had intended complete extermination. Who had revealed the plan? Who had violated the oath? Ea defended himself, arguing that total destruction had been too extreme, that humans served a purpose, that some needed to survive to maintain the world. He proposed instead that the gods should control human population through natural means rather than repeated catastrophes, through predators that would kill some humans, through disease that would cull the population, through infertility that would reduce birth rates. Enlil reluctantly agreed to this compromise. Humanity would survive, but under divine restraints that would prevent overpopulation and excessive noise. These Mesopotamian creation and flood myths provide crucial context for understanding the later Jewish traditions about the Watchers, because they establish patterns and themes that would reappear in different form. In both Mesopotamian and Jewish tradition, We see divine beings interacting with humans in the distant past, teaching them various arts and skills. In both traditions, we see a great flood sent to destroy humanity because they had become corrupt or troublesome. In both traditions, we see one righteous man warned by a beneficent deity who survives the flood by building a boat. The similarities are so striking that scholars agree there must be some relationship between these traditions, though they debate whether this represents Hebrew borrowing from Mesopotamian sources, independent accounts of the same historical events, or coincidental development of similar mythic patterns. Now it's important to pause here and make a critical distinction that affects how we interpret everything that follows. Everything discussed so far about the Anunnaki, about Sumerian and Babylonian religion, about the Enuma Elish Natrahasis, comes from actual ancient Mesopotamian texts that have been translated by scholars directly from original cuneiform tablets. These are the genuine religious beliefs of the Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian peoples who inhabited Mesopotamia from roughly 3500 BCE until the early centuries of the Common Era. They believed in these gods as literal divine persons, as conscious supernatural beings with power over nature and human affairs. They built massive temples to honor them, ziggurats reaching toward heaven where gods were thought to dwell. They organized their entire society around serving these deities, with kings claiming to rule by divine mandate, priests mediating between divine and human realms, and common people offering sacrifices and prayers. The Anunnaki were not aliens in ancient thought. They were gods, supernatural beings worthy of worship and fear, deserving of temples and sacrifices, capable of blessing and cursing, deciding fate and destiny. In modern times, particularly starting in the 1960s and 1970s, a completely different interpretation of these texts began to circulate, promoted by writers like Erich von Däniken and Zecharia Sitchin. These authors proposed that the Anunnaki were not gods at all, but rather extraterrestrial beings, advanced aliens from outer space who visited Earth in the distant past. Von Däniken, in his best-selling book Chariots of the Gods, published in 1968, argued that many ancient religious texts actually described encounters with space travelers that ancient peoples mistook advanced technology for magic, and aliens for gods. Sitchin went further and more specifically in his Earth Chronicles series, starting with the 12th planet in 1976. He claimed the Anunnaki were aliens from a planet called Nibiru, supposedly a large planet with a 3,600-year orbit that periodically comes close to Earth. According to Sitchin, these aliens came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold, which they needed for some purpose related to their planet's atmosphere. They initially did the mining themselves, but found the labor too burdensome, so they genetically engineered humans by combining their own DNA with that of Homo erectus, creating a slave species capable of performing the mining work. These theories have been universally rejected by scholars, archaeologists, astronomers, and linguists. There is no planet Nibiru. No planet with the orbital characteristics Sitchin described could exist in our solar system without having been detected by modern astronomy. Sitchin's translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts have been thoroughly debunked by actual scholars who read these languages. He mistranslated Sumerian words, sometimes wildly, giving them meanings they don't have. He quoted texts out of context, presenting fragments as if they said something completely different from their actual meaning in full context. He invented connections between texts that don't actually exist. He claimed technical knowledge in fields ranging from astronomy to genetics, where experts have shown his claims to be nonsense. No credible scholar in any relevant field supports his theories. The scholarly consensus is absolutely clear. The ancient Sumerians wrote about gods in their religious texts, not aliens. They understood these beings as divine, supernatural powers that controlled nature and human destiny, not as physical extraterrestrials with advanced technology. The temples, rituals, prayers, hymns, and myths all make, sense in a religious context but nonsense in an ancient astronaut framework. However, and this is crucial for understanding tonight's topic, what makes this story truly fascinating from a historical and religious studies perspective is not modern, pseudoscientific reinterpretations, but rather how these Mesopotamian traditions connect to other ancient Near Eastern texts, particularly Jewish apocalyptic literature from the Second Temple period. Because in texts like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find strikingly similar narratives about divine beings descending to Earth, interacting with humans, teaching forbidden knowledge, and facing divine judgment. The terminology shifts. Instead of Anunnaki, we find the Watchers, or in Hebrew, the Irin, meaning those who watch or those who are wakeful. Instead of Mesopotamia, the setting moves to the world of biblical patriarchs, to Mount Hermon and the land of Canaan. But the core, narrative elements remain eerily consistent. Divine beings from the heavens descend to earth in physical form. They take human women as wives, violating the boundaries between divine and human realms. They produce hybrid offspring of enormous size and power who wreak havoc on Earth. They teach humanity secrets and knowledge that humans were not meant to possess. The result is corruption, violence, and moral decay so severe that divine intervention becomes necessary. God or the gods send a catastrophic flood to cleanse the earth and start over with a remnant of humanity. The parallels are unmistakable. Either these are completely independent traditions that coincidentally developed similar narratives, or there is some historical connection, some shared cultural heritage, some common source from which both traditions draw. Given that the Jewish people spent significant time in Mesopotamia, particularly during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, when many biblical texts were being edited and compiled, cultural influence seems highly likely. But influence doesn't mean mere copying. The Jewish texts transform these traditions, reinterpreting them through the lens of monotheism and covenant theology, producing something genuinely different, even while retaining recognizable patterns. The Book of Enoch, though not included in most biblical canons today except for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, was enormously influential in Second Temple Judaism, the period roughly from 500 BCE to 70 CE. Multiple copies of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, indicating it was read and revered by Jewish communities in the time of Jesus. The New Testament epistles of Jude and 2 Peter both explicitly reference Enoch and appear to accept its narrative as historically accurate rather than mere allegory. Jude verses 14 through 15 quote directly from 1 Enoch chapter 1 verses 9, describing how Enoch prophesied judgment against the ungodly. Jude verse 6 speaks of the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, whom God has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. This clearly references the imprisonment of the Watchers as described in Enoch. 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 4 through 5 similarly references God not sparing the angels when they sinned but casting them into Tartarus, and committing them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, describing them in the same breath as the flood from Noah's time. Early church fathers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Athenagoras all quoted from the Book of Enoch and treated its account of fallen angels as authentic history, not mere mythology or allegory. They cited it when explaining the origin of demons, when discussing spiritual warfare, when warning against illicit sexual unions. Justin Martyr in his second apology explicitly describes angels lusting after women and begetting children who were demons. Athenagoras, in his Legatio, explains that demons are the offspring of angels who fell into impure love of virgins and were enslaved by fleshly desires. These early Christian theologians took the Enochic narrative seriously as a historical account of what actually happened in the antediluvian period. It was only in the 4th century CE, after Christianity became the Roman Empire's official religion and church hierarchy sought to standardize doctrine and eliminate texts considered problematic or potentially heretical, that the Book of Enoch began to be excluded from Christian scripture in most traditions. The reasons included doubts about its apostolic authorship, concerns about some of its theological claims, and the simple fact that it wasn't part of the Hebrew Bible canon that was being formalized around the same time. The book was essentially lost to Western scholarship for over 1,000 years. Most Europeans knew it existed only from ancient quotations. No complete manuscript was available. That changed in 1773 when Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia with 3 Ethiopic manuscripts of the complete Book of Enoch. These manuscripts, written in the Ge'ez language still used by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, preserved the entire text that had been lost in Europe. Translations into European languages followed in the early 1800s, shocking scholars with the book's contents and sparking intense debate about its historicity, dating, authorship and theological significance. Later discoveries in the 20th century provided additional manuscript evidence. Aramaic fragments of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, proving the book had existed in that language in the centuries before Christ. Greek fragments were identified in various European libraries where they had been misattributed to other works. These multiple manuscript traditions in different languages, all telling essentially the same story, demonstrated that Enoch had been widely circulated and was genuinely ancient, not a medieval forgery. Modern scholarship dates the earliest sections of 1st Enoch, particularly the Book of the Watchers, which comprises chapters 1 through 36, to sometime between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. The book is actually a collection of 5 separate books or sections, probably composed by different authors over a period of 2 or 3 centuries, and eventually compiled into a single work. The 5 sections are the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. Each section has distinctive characteristics in terms of themes, vocabulary, and theological emphasis, suggesting different authors and contexts. The oldest section is the Book of the Watchers, which describes events that allegedly occurred in the antediluvian period, the time before Noah's flood. The narrative begins with a time of population growth on Earth, when humanity multiplied and flourished across the face of the planet. In those days, beautiful daughters were born to humans, women of exceptional beauty and attractiveness, who caught the attention of beings in the heavenly realm. High above the earth, in the celestial realm where angels dwell in the presence of God, a class of angels known as the Watchers observed these developments with increasing interest and eventually with inappropriate desire. The Watchers were not ordinary angels. They were part of the Divine Council, a special class assigned specifically to watch over humanity, to observe human affairs without interfering directly, to report to God on what humans were doing, to serve as witnesses and monitors of human history as it unfolded. The very name Watchers, from the Aramaic word irin and the Hebrew word related to it, means those who are awake, or those who watch, or the wakeful ones. They were the eyes of heaven cast upon the earth, guardians and witnesses who were supposed to remain detached observers, present but not participating, watching but not intervening, recording but not influencing. They had a sacred duty, a divine commission, a specific role in the cosmic order. But as the Watchers looked down upon the daughters of men, as they observed these beautiful women living their lives on earth, something shifted within them. Something went terribly wrong. They began to feel desire, physical attraction, sexual lust toward these mortal women. This was a profound violation of the natural order, a crossing of boundaries that were meant to remain inviolate. Angels were spiritual beings, creatures of light and spirit, not flesh and blood. They existed in a different realm, operated according to different laws, had a completely different nature from humans. They were not meant to experience physical desire, were not equipped for physical reproduction, were not supposed to intermingle with the material creation in that way. Yet the desire grew and grew until it became an obsession that dominated their thoughts and eventually drove them to action. The Book of Enoch records the fateful moment when this desire transformed into conspiracy and then into rebellion. The Watchers began discussing among themselves the possibility of descending to Earth, taking human women as wives and producing offspring. This was unprecedented in cosmic history. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. It would be a fundamental transgression, a violation of the order established at creation, a breaking of the barriers between heaven and earth, between spirit and flesh, between divine and human realms. They knew it was wrong. They understood they were contemplating something forbidden. But the temptation proved too strong, the desire too overwhelming, the possibility too enticing to resist. Finally, they made the decision to do it, to abandon their posts, to forsake their sacred duty, to pursue their forbidden desires whatever the cost. The Watchers were led in this rebellion by an angel named Samyaza, also rendered in different manuscripts as Semjaza, Shemhaza, Semyaza, Azazel in some versions, or Shemyazaz depending on the textual tradition. The name appears in various forms across different manuscripts and translations, but all clearly refer to the same figure, the chief of the Watchers, their leader and spokesman. When the idea of descending to Earth was first proposed among the Watchers, Samyaza expressed serious concern about the plan. He feared that not all of them would have the courage to go through with such a radical step, that some might back out at the last moment, leaving him exposed and alone. If he went down to Earth and took a human wife while the others remained in heaven, he alone would bear the guilt and punishment for this great sin. He would face divine judgment by himself, would be held solely responsible, would suffer eternal condemnation for leading this rebellion, even though it had been a group decision. To ensure that no one would back out at the last moment, to guarantee that all participants would be equally committed and equally implicated, Samyaza proposed that they should all bind themselves together with a mutual oath. They would swear an oath in the name of God, invoking curses upon themselves if they failed to carry out their intention. This oath would be binding, unbreakable, enforced by the very divine power they were defying. They would curse themselves, calling down judgment if any among them retreated or exposed the others. This way, the responsibility and the punishment would be shared equally among all participants. They would all be accomplices, bound together in their rebellion, with no one able to claim innocence or argue they had been led astray by others. It was a collective decision, a group conspiracy, a shared crime that none could escape. The other Watchers agreed to this plan. They recognized the wisdom of binding themselves together, so none could back out or betray the others. The Book of Enoch records that there were 200 angels who decided to descend and participate in this rebellion. 200 divine beings, members of the highest ranks of the angelic host, chosen to watch over humanity and report to God, deliberately chose to abandon their heavenly posts, to forsake their sacred duties, to pursue their forbidden desires in direct defiance of divine law. This wasn't a momentary lapse, a sudden impulse, an accident. This was deliberate, premeditated rebellion. They discussed it among themselves, they made a pact, they swore an oath, they planned their descent carefully, they chose a specific location for their arrival on Earth. And then, in full knowledge of what they were doing and what the consequences would likely be, they descended. They chose a location for their arrival that would become infamous in Jewish and early Christian tradition, a place that would forever be associated with rebellion and transgression, a mountain whose very name would come to mean oath or curse. They chose Mount Hermon. Located on the border between modern-day Lebanon and Syria, part of the Anti-Lebanon mountain range running parallel to the more famous Lebanon mountains. Mount Hermon rises more than 9,200 feet above sea level, dominating the landscape for dozens of miles in every direction. Its peak, often crowned with snow even in summer, is visible from the Sea of Galilee 40 miles to the south, from Damascus 40 miles to the northeast, from the Mediterranean coast to the west. It's the highest mountain in the region, a natural boundary marker between territories, a source of water through snowmelt that feeds the Jordan River, a place of power and significance. In ancient times, before modern borders existed, it marked the northern limit of Israelite territory, the edge of the known world, a liminal space between the familiar and the foreign. The choice of Mount Hermon was deliberate and deeply symbolic. Mountains in ancient Near Eastern thought were often understood as the dwelling places of gods, as cosmic pillars connecting heaven and earth, as liminal spaces where the divine and human realms touched and could interact. The gods lived on mountaintops according to many traditions. In Canaanite religion, El the High God dwelt on a cosmic mountain at the source of the rivers. In Greek tradition, the gods lived on Mount Olympus. In Israelite tradition, God revealed himself on Mount Sinai and later dwelt in his temple on Mount Zion. Mountains were gateways between realms, places where heaven and earth met, where divine beings could most easily cross over into the material world. By descending to Mount Hermon, the Watchers were choosing a location that already carried sacred significance, a threshold between realms, a recognized place of divine presence and power. But they were perverting this sacredness, using a divine gateway for rebellious purposes, violating the very boundary they were supposed to guard. The Book of Enoch explicitly states that the Watchers named the mountain Hermon because they swore their binding oath upon its summit. The name Hermon comes from a Semitic root related to the word harem, which has meanings including ban, curse, devotion, consecration, or binding oath. A harem could be a positive thing, something devoted to God and set apart as holy, or it could be a curse, something devoted to destruction. In this context, the Watchers swore a harem upon themselves, a binding curse that would ensure none of them could escape their collective fate. The mountain became Hermon, the mountain of the oath or curse, because of what happened there. Every time later generations spoke the name Hermon, they would be reminded of this primordial rebellion, of the place where angels fell, where divine beings violated their sacred trust, where the boundary between heaven and earth was breached. The descent occurred, according to the text, in the days of Jared. Jared was a figure in the genealogy of Genesis chapter 5, part of the line from Adam through Seth to Noah. He was the father of Enoch, who himself was the father of Methuselah, who was the father of Lamech, who was the father of Noah. This places the event roughly 5 or 6 generations before the flood in biblical chronology. Jared lived 962 years according to Genesis, typical of the extraordinarily long lifespans attributed to antediluvian patriarchs. His name in Hebrew, Yered, comes from a root meaning to descend or to go down. Ancient Jewish interpreters saw this as deeply significant. Jared was named for the descent, or the descent happened during his lifetime, or perhaps both. His very name memorialized the event, marking his era as the time when the Watchers came down. This would place the event somewhere in the mid to late 2nd millennium of human history according to biblical chronology, though of course this chronology is itself subject to various interpretations and calculations. On the summit of Mount Hermon, the 200 Watchers stood together in assembly and swore their terrible oath. They bound themselves with mutual curses and imprecations, calling down judgment on anyone who would violate their pact. Each knew full well the gravity of what they were about to do. This wasn't ignorance or innocent mistake. This was knowing, willful rebellion. They understood they were violating divine law. They knew they were crossing boundaries meant to remain inviolate. They recognized they were abandoning their sacred duty. But they did it anyway, driven by desire, by lust, by the overwhelming compulsion to possess what was forbidden. Having sworn the oath, having bound themselves together in their conspiracy, having committed themselves irrevocably to this course of action, they descended. They left the heavenly realm where they belonged. They took on physical form or made their spiritual forms capable of physical interaction. They manifested on Mount Hermon in a way that humans could see and touch and hear. And from there, they dispersed across the face of the earth to find human women to take as wives. The Book of Enoch provides names for 20 of the leaders, the chiefs of tens who each commanded a squad of 10 watchers under their authority, organized in a military-style hierarchy. The primary leader, the chief of all the watchers who led this rebellion, was Samyaza, whose name may mean name of Azza, or heaven has heard, depending on interpretation. Under him were 19 other chiefs, each commanding their own unit. Arakiel, whose name means Earth of God, would teach humans the signs of the earth, divination through natural phenomena, what we might call geomancy. Amaras, whose name may mean Cursed One, would teach humanity the resolving of enchantments, essentially counterspells and magical protections. Barakiel, meaning Lightning of God, would teach astrology, the observation and interpretation of stars and planets. Kokabiel, meaning Star of God, would teach the signs of the constellations, astronomical knowledge about star patterns. Ramel, Tamiel, Daniel, Ezekiel, meaning God has judged and God will strengthen, bearing names that ironically invoke divine power while engaged in rebellion against that very power. Sariel, meaning command of God. Asael, or Azazel, whose name means God strengthens, or possibly scapegoat, who would become especially notorious for his teachings. Batajal, Ananel, Zakiel, Samsavil, Satariel, Turel, Jomjael, Sariel appearing twice in some lists with slight spelling variations. Each of these 20 chiefs commanded 10 watchers, for a total of 200 who descended together, bound by oath, committed to their course. This military organization suggests they understood what they were doing as a coordinated operation, a planned rebellion, not a chaotic impulse. They had structure, hierarchy, leadership, organization. This made them more dangerous but also more culpable. This was rebellion in the fullest sense, a conspiracy to violate divine law, a collective decision to pursue forbidden desires whatever the cost. Once they had descended and taken physical form capable of interacting with the material world, the Watchers did exactly what they had plotted and planned. They took for themselves wives from among the daughters of men, not asking permission, not seeking consent from fathers or families, but simply taking any women they desired by virtue of their superior power and supernatural presence. The text says they chose any they desired, suggesting they selected the most beautiful, the most attractive, the most desirable women they could find. These unions were not sanctioned by divine law, were not part of God's plan for creation, were not blessed or approved. They were acts of lust and rebellion, violations of the created order, transgressions that would have catastrophic consequences. The Watchers were not meant to procreate with humans. They were not designed for physical reproduction. They existed in a completely different realm with completely different natural laws. But they found a way, whether through taking on flesh, through supernatural intervention in natural processes, or through means the text doesn't explain. They produced offspring, and those children would become a plague upon the earth, monsters of unnatural size and power who would spread violence and corruption until divine intervention became necessary. Meanwhile, even before their offspring were born, the Watchers began teaching humanity knowledge that had been kept hidden, mysteries that existed in the heavens, secrets that humans were not meant to possess. This wasn't benevolent education meant to help humanity progress. This was the revelation of forbidden knowledge, the sharing of secrets that would corrupt rather than enlighten, that would enable violence rather than promote peace, that would lead to destruction rather than construction. Let's examine what exactly the Watchers taught, because this is crucial to understanding why their actions were seen as so catastrophic and why they faced such severe punishment. The fallen angel Azazel, sometimes called Asael in different manuscripts, is singled out for particular blame in the text of 1st Enoch. He bore special responsibility for corrupting humanity through his teachings. Azazel taught men how to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He revealed the secrets of metallurgy, showing humans how to extract metals from ore, how to smelt copper and tin to make bronze, how to forge and temper weapons. He taught the techniques of weapon making, of creating instruments specifically designed to kill other humans, efficiently. Before this revelation, according to the narrative, humanity lived in a more primitive state without metal weapons, without the technology of organized warfare, without the means to kill each other in large numbers. Violence existed, certainly, but it was limited by the weapons available, mostly clubs and stones and perhaps crude wooden spears. Azazel changed all that by introducing military technology, by teaching the metallurgical arts applied to weaponry. He taught how to forge swords that could cut through flesh and bone, knives that could stab and slice, shields that could deflect blows, breastplates and armor that could protect warriors and make them more effective in battle. This enabled organized warfare on a scale never before seen. It made killing more efficient, more deadly, more widespread. It transformed human conflict from occasional violent incidents into systematic warfare that could destroy entire populations. But Azazel didn't only teach weapons, he also taught the making of bracelets and ornaments, the decorative arts, the use of precious stones and metals for adornment. He taught women how to apply antimony around their eyes as cosmetic enhancement, how to use various dyes and pigments to beautify their appearance, how to apply makeup and modify their natural looks. In ancient Jewish thought, this wasn't seen as innocent beauty enhancement, but as promoting vanity, as encouraging deception through artificial appearance, as facilitating seduction and sexual immorality. The connection between cosmetics and sexual sin in this tradition stems from the idea that beautification beyond natural appearance is deceptive, that it represents an attempt to manipulate others through false presentation, that it encourages lust and inappropriate desire. The teaching of these cosmetic arts was associated with the general breakdown of moral boundaries, with the rise of promiscuity, with the corruption of natural relations between men and women. Whether we agree with this assessment or find it deeply problematic by modern standards, it reflects the worldview of the text's authors, who saw artificial beautification as part of the broader corruption introduced by the Watchers. Other fallen Watchers contributed their own forbidden knowledge according to the detailed lists provided in Enoch. Arachiel taught humans the signs of the earth, what we might call geomancy, divination, through interpreting natural features, reading omens in rocks and soil and vegetation patterns. This was forbidden not because observing nature is wrong, but because interpreting these observations as divine signs, as ways to predict the future or discern hidden knowledge, violated the principle that humans should trust in God alone for guidance, rather than seeking secret knowledge through divinatory practices. Barachiel taught astrology, the observation and interpretation of stars and planets as omens and as forces controlling human destiny. Again, the problem wasn't astronomy itself, the scientific observation of celestial bodies, but rather the interpretation of these bodies as gods, or as deterministic forces controlling human fate. In biblical theology, the heavenly bodies are created things, parts of the physical universe made by God to mark seasons and times, not divine powers to be worshipped or consulted. Treating them as sources of knowledge about the future or as controllers of destiny was seen as idolatry, as attributing divine power to created things rather than to the Creator. Kokabeel taught the signs of the constellations, deeper astronomical knowledge about star patterns and their movements. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, solar observations and interpretations. Sariel taught the signs of the moon, lunar cycles and their meanings. This triad of teachers covering sun, moon and stars represents a complete system of celestial divination, of seeking to read the future and understand hidden things through observing the heavens. Armaros taught humanity the resolving of enchantments, essentially counter magic, how to break spells, how to protect against magical attacks, how to neutralize the power of curses. This implies that other watchers or humans who learned from them were practicing offensive magic, casting spells and curses, and Armaros provided the defensive knowledge to counter these attacks. The whole system represents an arms race in magical knowledge, with both offensive and defensive techniques being revealed and refined. Pennimu taught the art of writing with ink and paper, which at first glance seems entirely positive. Writing is one of humanity's greatest inventions, enabling the preservation and transmission of knowledge across time and space. But the text frames this as part of the forbidden knowledge, because writing allows the preservation and dissemination of all the other forbidden arts. With writing, secrets can be recorded in books, spells can be codified in grimoires. Forbidden knowledge can spread from person to person, from generation to generation, instead of dying with each individual practitioner. Writing enables the systematic development and accumulation of knowledge that was meant to remain hidden. Caste taught humans about spirits and demons, essentially demonology and necromancy, how to contact spiritual entities, how to summon and control them, how to use them for magical purposes. This opened channels of communication with the spiritual realm that were supposed to remain closed, inviting possession and corruption through traffic with evil spirits. Gadriel taught the making of weapons and killing techniques, the martial arts, the most efficient methods of causing death and injury in hand-to-hand combat. Ramel taught how to interpret omens in various natural phenomena. Tamiel taught more advanced astrology. The list varies slightly across different manuscripts, but the pattern is clear. The Watchers reveal to humanity an entire system of forbidden knowledge covering warfare, magic, divination, cosmetics, and the occult. The cumulative effect of all this teaching was catastrophic for humanity, according to the narrative. Humanity gained knowledge and power far beyond its capacity to use it wisely or morally. Humans suddenly possessed metallurgical skills that enabled mass warfare, magical techniques that could harm and kill from a distance, divinatory methods that encouraged dependence on supernatural signs rather than moral reasoning, cosmetic arts that promoted vanity and deception. The immediate result, according to First Enoch, was an explosion of violence. Warfare became endemic. Cities fought cities. Tribes fought tribes. Humans used their newly acquired weapons to kill each other in unprecedented numbers. Warfare escalated from occasional raids to systematic campaigns of conquest and annihilation. The teaching of weapons and war-making enabled a level of organized violence that had never before existed. Alongside the violence came a general breakdown of moral boundaries. Occultism became widespread as people practiced the magical arts taught by the Watchers, casting spells, summoning spirits, seeking hidden knowledge through divination. Sexual immorality increased, promoted by the cosmetic arts that enhance physical attractiveness and by the general atmosphere of lawlessness and corruption. The text says that godlessness increased everywhere, that fornication became rampant, that humans were led astray and became corrupt in all their ways, abandoning the paths of righteousness and embracing wickedness in every form. The earth itself, the physical creation, began to cry out under the weight of so much bloodshed and sin. The ground that had drunk the blood of Abel killed by Cain now absorbed the blood of thousands, then tens of thousands, then more as violence multiplied and warfare spread. But the corruption didn't stop with human wickedness enabled by forbidden knowledge. The hybrid offspring of the Watchers and human women began to be born, and these children were unlike anything the world had seen. Monstrous beings who would make the violence taught by their fathers seem mild by comparison. They were called the Nephilim, a Hebrew word that appears in Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 in the brief biblical account of this era. The etymology of Nephilim is debated by scholars. Many connect it to the Hebrew root nephol, meaning to fall, so Nephilim could mean the fallen ones, suggesting their divine descent from heaven to earth, or those who cause others to fall, indicating their corrupting influence, or those who fall upon, suggesting their violence and aggression. The ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, rendered Nephilim as gigantes, from which we derive the English word giants. This Greek word doesn't primarily mean large size, though that's included, but rather earthborn monsters, beings born from the earth or from the union of gods with earth, creatures that shouldn't exist, violations of natural order. And giants they certainly were in the tradition of First Enoch. The text describes them as being of monstrous size. One passage says their height reached 3,000 ells. An ell, also called a cubit, is roughly 18 inches, the distance from elbow to fingertip. 3,000 ells would be 4,500 feet tall, obviously a symbolic or exaggerated number, but indicating enormous size beyond anything in normal human experience. Other ancient Jewish sources give similarly hyperbolic measurements. The Book of Giants found among the Dead Sea Scrolls mentions Nephilim of tremendous size. The Book of Jubilees describes giants whose height was 3,000 cubits, still enormous even if we assume smaller cubits. Even if we take these as symbolic exaggerations, poetic hyperbole meant to convey overwhelming size rather than literal measurements. The point remains clear. These beings were unnaturally large, terrifyingly huge, far beyond normal human scale. But the Nephilim were not merely large. They possessed supernatural strength, enhanced abilities, powers that exceeded anything possible for normal humans. They were violent by nature, destructive in their instincts, utterly without regard for human life or suffering. They were insatiable in their appetites for food, for violence, for domination. The text describes in disturbing detail how they consumed all the produce that humans could provide. Farmers worked their fields and brought in harvests, but the Nephilim ate everything. Shepherds tended flocks, but the Nephilim consumed entire herds. Humans worked and toiled to feed these monsters, but nothing was ever enough. The Nephilim's appetites were bottomless. They demanded more and more, eating everything humans could produce, stripping the land bare, driving humanity to the brink of starvation. When food finally ran out, when there was simply nothing left for humans to give them, the Nephilim didn't starve. They didn't go hungry. They didn't reduce their consumption. Instead, they turned their appetites on humanity itself. They began to devour human beings. Cannibalism became widespread. The giants hunted humans like animals, killed them, ate their flesh. This wasn't survival cannibalism driven by desperation. This was predation, humans as prey, the Nephilim treating people as a food source. The horror of this situation is difficult to overstate. Imagine living in a world dominated by creatures of enormous size and strength, who view you as livestock, who hunt your family and neighbors for food, who cannot be fought or stopped or reasoned with. But even cannibalism wasn't the limit of their depravity. The text says the Nephilim began to sin against animals, against birds, against reptiles, against fish. They killed and consumed everything indiscriminately. They violated the natural order in every possible way. They turned on one another as well, engaging in internecine warfare, giants fighting giants. They drank one another's blood in their battles, adding vampirism to their list of abominations. The world descended into complete chaos. The natural order collapsed. The boundaries between species meant to be maintained were violated systematically. The earth became soaked in blood, human and animal alike. Everywhere there was violence, screaming death, corruption. The Nephilim dominated the landscape absolutely, unchecked and apparently unstoppable. Normal humans were utterly helpless before them, as insignificant as grasshoppers before elephants. According to the text, the cries of suffering humanity rose up to heaven like incense, like the smoke of offerings, carrying the desperate pleas of the oppressed and dying to the throne of God. The earth itself cried out in accusation against the Watchers and their offspring, against those responsible for this catastrophe. The violence, the bloodshed, the corruption, the utter breakdown of order had become so severe that creation itself was groaning, suffering, begging for intervention. The situation had become unsustainable. If it continued, humanity would be driven to extinction. The Nephilim would consume everything and everyone. The forbidden knowledge would spread farther. The corruption would deepen. Something had to be done to stop the spiral into complete chaos and annihilation. In heaven, 4 great archangels witnessed what was happening on earth and understood that the situation demanded divine response. These 4 archangels were Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, the highest-ranking angels in Jewish tradition, the chief servants of God who stand in his presence, who execute his will, who serve as his agents in governing the cosmos. Michael, whose name means "who is like God," in the form of a rhetorical question implying no one is like God, was the warrior angel, the defender of God's people, the one who fights against divine enemies. Uriel, whose name means "God is my light," or fire of God, was associated with wisdom and interpretation, with revealing divine knowledge and explaining mysteries. Raphael, whose name means "God heals," was the angel of healing and protection, who restored what had been broken or corrupted. And Gabriel, whose name means "God is my strength," or mighty man of God, was the messenger angel who delivered important divine communications, who announced significant events, who revealed God's plans. These 4 archangels saw the devastation on earth. They observed the corruption introduced by the Watchers, who had abandoned their posts and violated their sacred trust. They watched the violence perpetrated by the Nephilim, who were destroying humanity and all living things. They witnessed humans learning and practicing the forbidden arts taught by the fallen angels. They saw that the world was on the verge of total collapse, that the human race faced extinction, that God's creation was being systematically destroyed by these rebellious angels and their monstrous offspring. The archangels approached God with a petition, essentially filing a formal complaint or request for intervention. They recounted everything that had transpired. They described in detail how Azazel had taught weapons and warfare, enabling mass violence. They explained how Sam Yazeh and his cohort of 200 Watchers had taken human wives and produced the giant Nephilim who were now ravaging the earth. They reported how forbidden knowledge had spread, how occultism and divination had become widespread, how the moral order had collapsed. They emphasized that the earth itself was crying out in desperation, that creation was suffering under the weight of so much bloodshed and corruption. Then they made what was almost an accusation, a pointed observation that carried an implicit question. Although God surely knew all of this, omniscient and all-seeing, he had not yet given them instructions to intervene. Why had God allowed this to continue so long? What were the angels supposed to do about it? Should they act on their own initiative or await divine command? The question pushed God, in the way that petitions sometimes do, to make a decision and announce a course of action. The answer came swiftly and decisively. God issued a series of commands to the 4 archangels, each with a specific mission to accomplish, each targeting a different aspect of the crisis. The divine response was comprehensive, addressing both the immediate symptoms and the underlying causes, both the monstrous offspring and their angelic fathers, both the corrupted earth and the righteous remnant who would survive. To Uriel, God gave the task of warning Noah. The righteous man Noah, descendant of Seth through the line of Enoch, who had remained faithful to God despite living in an utterly corrupt generation, needed to know that a great flood was coming. He needed time to prepare, to build an ark according to specifications that would be provided, to gather his family and representatives of all animal species. The flood would serve as a cosmic reset button, washing away the corruption and violence that had polluted the earth, cleansing the world of the Nephilim and their human victims alike, eliminating the forbidden knowledge and the practitioners of occult arts, starting over with a remnant of humanity through Noah's family. Uriel was to go to Noah and warn him, providing detailed instructions for survival, ensuring that humanity wouldn't be completely exterminated, but would have a fresh start after the purging flood. To Raphael, God gave a specific and deeply disturbing task. Go and bind Azazel hand and foot. Take him to the desert wilderness called Dudael. Make an opening in the earth, a pit or chasm. Cast Azazel into this pit. Place rough and jagged rocks over him, heaping sharp stones to ensure he cannot escape, crushing him under there. Wait. Cover his face with stones so that no light reaches him, so he remains in complete darkness, isolated from all sight and sound. There he would remain until the great day of final judgment, at which point he would be thrown into eternal fire. This punishment was necessary, God explained to Raphael, so that the earth could be healed. Azazel had corrupted humanity through his teachings. He'd revealed the eternal mysteries that exist in heaven, secrets that humans were never meant to know. He had taught violence and warfare, enabling mass slaughter. He bore primary responsibility for the corruption, and his imprisonment was essential to the healing process. All sin, the text says, would be ascribed to Azazel. He would serve as a scapegoat bearing the blame for all that had gone wrong. The very word scapegoat in English comes from this tradition, from the goat sent into the wilderness on the Day of Atonement carrying the sins of Israel, driven out to Azazel in the desert. The imagery of Azazel's punishment is striking and specific. He would be imprisoned beneath the earth in a desolate wilderness, a place called Dudael, whose name might mean God's cauldron or God's crucible, suggesting a place of intense suffering and purification through torment. He would be buried under jagged rocks, stones that would cut and pierce and crush. He would have his face covered so no light could reach him, condemned to absolute darkness, total sensory deprivation. For a being who had been an angel of the light, who had dwelt in the presence of God, who had experienced the glory of heaven, this would be the ultimate torment. Complete isolation, crushing weight, eternal darkness, separation from all light and life and joy. He would remain there for ages, imprisoned beneath the desert, waiting for the final judgment when he would be transferred from this earthly prison to the eternal fires of hell. To Gabriel, God assigned the task of dealing with the Nephilim themselves, the monstrous offspring who were destroying humanity and all life on earth. Gabriel was commanded to incite the giants to destroy one another. He was to set them against each other in battle, to manipulate them into turning their violence on themselves to ensure that they killed each other off before the floodwaters came. The Nephilim would not be allowed to continue their rampage. Their very existence was an abomination, a violation of natural law, a corruption that had to be eliminated completely. Gabriel would accomplish this not through direct combat but through manipulation, using their own violent natures against them, turning their aggression inward until none remained. It's a grim task, but necessary according to the divine judgment. These beings shouldn't exist. They were products of forbidden union, hybrid monsters who had no place in God's creation. They had to be destroyed utterly, every single one eliminated so that none survived to continue their corruption. To Michael, the highest-ranking archangel, God gave the command regarding Samyasa and the rest of the Watchers, the 200 angels who had descended to earth and violated divine law by taking human wives. Michael was to bind them, but not immediately. First, they would be forced to watch the destruction of their children. They would see the Nephilim whom they had fathered killing each other in fratricidal violence. They would witness their monstrous offspring dying in battle, destroying themselves through the very violence they had inflicted on others. They would be helpless to intervene, forced to watch as everything they had created was annihilated. Only after they had seen this, only after they had experienced the full horror of their children's destruction, would Michael bind them. He would chain them in the valleys of the earth, deep beneath the surface, in the darkness under mountains, in prison chambers far from light or life. There they would remain for 70 generations, a symbolic number representing a long but finite period, perhaps referring to the time until final judgment. During this imprisonment, they would reflect on their crimes, remember their lost glory, suffer the consequences of their rebellion, and await their ultimate fate. After those 70 generations on the great day of judgment at the end of history, they would be led forth from their earthly prison to the fiery abyss, to Gehenna, to the lake of fire, to everlasting torment and punishment. This wasn't a temporary sentence that would eventually end. This was an eternal condemnation. The Watchers who abandoned their posts, who pursued forbidden desires, who corrupted humanity, who produced monstrous offspring, who taught dangerous knowledge, would spend eternity in fire, suffering without end, punished without hope of reprieve or redemption. The text emphasizes the comprehensive nature of this judgment. They would be bound, imprisoned, isolated, and finally condemned to eternal fire. There was no escape, no appeal, no possibility of mercy or forgiveness. They had made their choice knowing the consequences, had sworn their oath knowing what they risked, had pursued their desires knowing they violated divine law. Now they would face the full measure of divine justice. Interestingly, the punishment of the Watchers wasn't limited to the earthly imprisonment described in Enoch. The New Testament references these events and adds additional detail about their fate. Second, Peter chapter 2 verse 4 speaks of God not sparing the angels when they sinned, but casting them into Tartarus and committing them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. Tartarus is a term from Greek mythology, referring to the deepest abyss of the underworld, the prison of the Titans who rebelled against Zeus, a place below even Hades where the most terrible criminals were imprisoned. The New Testament writer adapts this term to describe the prison of the fallen Watchers, equating it with the earthly imprisonment described in Enoch but using Greek terminology that his readers would understand. Jude verse 6 similarly describes angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, kept by God in eternal chains in deepest darkness until the judgment of the great day. These New Testament passages demonstrate that early Christians accepted the Enochic account as factually true, as actual history rather than mere allegory. The fallen Watchers were real beings who had really rebelled, really taken human wives, really produced monstrous offspring, and were really imprisoned awaiting final judgment. The flood came just as God had warned Noah. Genesis describes rain falling for 40 days and 40 nights, with the fountains of the deep bursting open and the windows of heaven pouring forth water in a deluge that covered the entire world. Every living thing on the face of the earth drowned, except for Noah, his family, and the animals preserved in the ark. The Nephilim perished in the floodwaters. Their immense size and strength couldn't save them when the whole world was submerged. They died along with all the corrupt humans who had practiced the forbidden arts, who had benefited from the Watchers' teachings, who had participated in the general breakdown of moral order. The flood was divine judgment, but also divine mercy, an act of cleansing that would give humanity a fresh start, a reset that would eliminate the corruption introduced by the Watchers and restore the possibility of righteous living. But according to the Book of Enoch, the story didn't quite end there. The physical bodies of the Nephilim died in the flood, but something else happened to their spirits. Because the Nephilim were hybrids, part angel and part human, their deaths didn't result in the same fate as normal human deaths. When humans die, their spirits depart to Sheol, the realm of the dead, where they await resurrection and final judgment. But when the Nephilim died, something different occurred. Their spirits remained on earth. They became disembodied entities, ghosts without bodies, spirits without flesh, condemned to wander the earth eternally, unable to depart to heaven or descend to Sheol, trapped in the earthly realm. First Enoch chapter 15 explains this in theological detail. God tells Enoch why the Watchers will receive no peace or forgiveness despite their pleas. The spirits of heaven, meaning the angels, have their proper dwelling in heaven. They are immortal beings without need of food or drink or earthly sustenance. They live eternally in the divine presence. But the Watchers left their heavenly abode. They defiled themselves with human women. They produced offspring who were neither fully divine nor fully human. These hybrid offspring, born on earth with bodies that came from human mothers, had a dual nature that resulted in a unique fate when they died. Their bodies perished like any mortal thing, but the spiritual component inherited from their angelic fathers continued. And because these spirits originated from flesh, because they were born in the material realm, they remained attached to the earthly plane. They couldn't ascend to heaven because they had never belonged there. They couldn't enter Sheol because they weren't fully human. They were trapped, earthbound, forever wandering. The text states explicitly that from the day of the slaughter and destruction of the giants, from the souls of whose flesh the spirits went forth, they afflict and oppress humanity. They attack, fight, and destroy on the earth. They are the spirits of the wicked, violent, and destructive, refusing rest. These disembodied Nephilim spirits became what Jewish and Christian tradition would identify as demons, evil spirits that wander the earth seeking to possess human hosts, to influence human behavior, to cause suffering and destruction. This understanding had profound implications for Jewish and early Christian demonology, providing an origin story for the demonic forces that plague humanity. Demons weren't originally fallen angels, though they served alongside fallen angels under Satan's leadership. They were the spirits of dead Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of the Watchers, forever trapped on earth, forever seeking bodies to inhabit, forever refusing peace or rest. This explains why demons in the New Testament are described as seeking embodiment, as trying to possess human hosts. They lost their physical forms in the flood. They exist now only as spirits, desperately longing to experience physicality again, but unable to generate their own bodies. They can only possess the bodies of others, temporarily experiencing physical sensation through their victims. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 12, Jesus describes an unclean spirit that goes out of a person, wanders through waterless places seeking rest but finding none, then returns to its former host. This imagery of restless wandering, of spirits seeking but not finding rest, fits perfectly with the Enochic understanding of demons as disembodied Nephilim. They have no home, no peace, no rest. They are forever agitated, forever seeking, forever frustrated, wandering the earth until the final judgment when they too will be consigned to eternal fire, along with their Watcher fathers and Satan who commands them. The idea that demons are the spirits of dead Nephilim was widely accepted in early Judaism and Christianity. It appears in the Book of Jubilees, which adds that God allowed 10% of these spirits to remain active under the command of Mastema or Satan, while binding the other 90% in places of punishment. It's found in the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, in the writings of church fathers including Justin Martyr, who explicitly connects demons to the offspring of fallen angels, and Origen, who discusses the nature of evil, spirits in relation to the Nephilim. This understanding shaped Christian demonology for centuries, influencing beliefs about possession, exorcism, spiritual warfare, and the nature of evil. It provided a framework for understanding why the world contains both human wickedness and supernatural evil, why demonic forces afflict humanity, why spiritual warfare is necessary, and why deliverance ministries seek to cast out evil spirits. Modern Christianity has often lost this connection, treating demons simply as fallen angels without the Enochic backstory, but the early church took seriously the origin of demons in the hybrid offspring of the Watchers. Now, as we near the end of our exploration tonight, let's step back and consider the profound parallels and connections between these different ancient traditions. In Sumerian and Babylonian texts, the Anunnaki descended from heaven to earth, established civilization, and taught humanity various arts and sciences, though the Mesopotamian accounts generally present this as beneficial rather than corrupting. In the Book of Enoch and related Jewish texts, the Watchers descended from heaven to earth, took human wives, taught forbidden knowledge, and produced monstrous offspring, with the entire sequence presented as catastrophically evil. In Mesopotamian myth, divine human unions sometimes produced heroes and kings, mighty men of renown, figures who were celebrated rather than condemned. In Jewish tradition, these unions produced the Nephilim, violent giants who had to be destroyed. In both traditions there is a great flood that resets creation, though the reasons differ. In Mesopotamian myth, the gods send the flood because humans are too numerous and noisy. In biblical and Enochic tradition, the flood specifically targets the corruption introduced by the Watchers and Nephilim. Some scholars suggest these accounts share a common origin, perhaps rooted in an actual catastrophic flood event in Mesopotamian prehistory that various cultures remembered and reinterpreted through their own theological lenses. Others see this as cultural borrowing, with Jewish scribes adapting Mesopotamian myths and reframing them within monotheistic theology. Still others believe these are independent traditions that happen to share similar motifs, because such motifs are common in human mythology worldwide. Whatever the historical relationship, the theological differences are profound. Mesopotamian texts present the creation of humans as a practical solution to divine labor problems. Jewish texts present human creation as part of God's good design, with corruption entering later through rebellion. Mesopotamian gods are capricious, often acting on selfish motives. The God of Israel is just, acting according to moral principles. Mesopotamian floods are sent to restore quiet for sleeping gods. The biblical flood is divine judgment on wickedness with provision for a righteous remnant. These aren't merely stylistic differences, but represent fundamentally different understandings of divinity, morality, and human purpose. Thank you for joining me on this journey through forgotten texts, ancient mysteries, and the disturbing accounts of divine rebellion and judgment. If you found this exploration valuable, please take a moment to like this video, to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future episodes, and to share it with others who might appreciate these deep dives into the shadows of history. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on these accounts. Do you see them as mythology crafted to explain the existence of evil and suffering? Do you interpret them as actual historical events, literal descriptions of what happened in the antediluvian world? Or do you find truth somewhere in between, seeing these as stories that encode theological truths even if not literally factual in every detail? What do you make of the parallels between Mesopotamian and Jewish traditions? And remember, these stories aren't just about the distant past, they're about the present, about the choices we face every day. They're about boundaries and their violation, about knowledge and its proper use, about desire and its control, about power and its corrupting influence. They warn us that not all knowledge should be pursued, that some boundaries exist for good reason, that power without wisdom leads to destruction, that crossing lines meant to remain inviolate unleashes chaos we cannot control. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, stay humble in the face of mysteries that dwarf our understanding. Keep exploring the ancient texts that connect us to those who came before. And most importantly, consider carefully what boundaries you will respect and what desires you will pursue, for the choices we make echo through time with consequences we can barely imagine. Good night.